The moment the design board trembled under his fingers, everything changed. Armin Qureshi hadn't meant to touch it. Not really. His hand had moved on instinct, like a reflex pulled from a life he no longer lived. 1 second he was mopping the polished marble floor of the executive design wing, and the next, his eyes had locked onto the sketch. A flaw. A glaring, painful flaw in a concept that could have been brilliant. His fingers, rough from years of labor, gently shifted the tracing paper just a fraction, aligning the perspective. It was almost nothing. Almost invisible. But to someone who knew, it was everything. And then the silence broke. A sharp voice cut through the room like glass. Within seconds, the towering presence of CEO Saira Mehta loomed behind him, her expression hard, eyes blazing with disbelief and anger. The room, once filled with quiet creativity, turned cold. Employees froze. No one dared to breathe. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that people are more than their circumstances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Echoes the Stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. Armin stepped back immediately, lowering his gaze. He knew that look. It wasn't just anger, it was judgment. The kind that stripped away everything you were and reduced you to the role you played. Cyrus' voice didn't rise, but its sharpness made it worse. Rules were rules. This floor was restricted. Janitorial staff were not allowed near the design boards, let alone touching them. It was a violation of protocol, professionalism, and trust. She didn't ask why. She didn't hesitate. Security was called. Armin didn't protest. He didn't explain. He simply nodded, removed his worn gloves, and stood still as the weight of the moment settled over him. His uniform, slightly faded but always clean, felt heavier than ever. He had worked here for 2 years, invisible but consistent. Always early. Always quiet. Always grateful. And now, in a single moment, it was over. As he walked out of the glass doors, escorted by security, the sunlight outside felt almost mocking. It was a bright, clear day, too beautiful for something like this. Inside his chest, though, it felt like something had collapsed. What no one knew, what Saira didn't know, was that Armin hadn't always been a janitor. Years ago, he had been an architect. A brilliant one. His designs had once won awards, been featured in magazines, admired by people who now wouldn't even look at him twice. But life doesn't always follow clean lines and perfect angles. After his wife passed away during a difficult childbirth, everything unraveled. Medical bills swallowed his savings. His firm collapsed after a failed partnership. And suddenly, Armin was left alone, with a newborn son and a world that didn't care about his past achievements. He took whatever job he could find. Pride didn't matter anymore. Feeding his son did. So he became invisible. Back inside the building, something unexpected happened. Saira stood frozen in front of the design board. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the adjustment Armin had made. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it fixed the core issue that her entire team had been struggling with for days. She leaned closer. The angles aligned perfectly now. The balance of the structure made sense. The visual tension was gone. It was right. Her heart skipped. She called over her lead designer, who studied the board, confusion quickly turning into amazement. This wasn't just a random adjustment. It was deliberate. Skilled. The kind of correction only someone with deep understanding could make. A cold realization crept in. Who was that man? 5 minutes. That's how long it took for certainty to replace doubt. 5 minutes later, Saira was running. The same CEO who had just fired a janitor without hesitation was now rushing through the lobby, ignoring curious stares, her composure slipping for the first time in years. Outside, Armin was already halfway down the street, his shoulders slightly hunched, his steps slow but steady. He wasn't rushing. He had nowhere urgent to be. Losing a job like this didn't come with panic anymore. It came with a quiet, familiar ache. Saira called out to him. He stopped, turning slowly. For a brief moment, their eyes met, not as CEO and janitor, but as two people standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding too big to ignore. Saira's voice, when it came, was different now. Softer. Urgent. Almost uncertain. She asked him about the design. Armin hesitated. Years of being dismissed had taught him caution. But something in her expression, something real, made him answer. He explained the flaw. The misalignment. The way the structure's weight distribution didn't visually translate into stability. His words were simple, but precise. And just like that, the truth was undeniable. Saira felt a wave of shock crash over her. She had just fired a man who understood her project better than her entire team. Back in her office, the tension was unbearable. Armin sat quietly across from her, his hands resting on his knees. The same man who had been invisible hours ago was now the center of attention. Not because of who he appeared to be, but because of what he knew. Saira listened as he spoke about design like it was second nature. Not arrogantly. Not to impress. Just, honestly. He didn't talk about his past at first. But when she asked, gently this time, he told her everything. The career. The loss. The fall. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just acceptance. And that made it worse. Because Syra realized something uncomfortable, she had judged him instantly. Not based on skill, or character, or truth. But on a uniform. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. In all her years of leadership, she had prided herself on precision, discipline, and high standards. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing people. Really seeing them. Now, sitting in front of her, was a man who had lost everything, and still carried himself with quiet dignity. And she had dismissed him in seconds. The offer came quickly. Not out of pity. Not out of guilt. But out of recognition. She asked him to return, not as a janitor, but as a design consultant. Armin didn't respond immediately. Because for him, this wasn't just about a job. It was about whether the world that had once abandoned him was finally ready to see him again. Days passed. Inside the office, whispers spread. The janitor, who fixed the CEO's design, became something of a quiet legend. Some were skeptical. Others were curious. But as Armin began working alongside the team, doubt slowly gave way to respect. He didn't try to prove himself. He didn't boast about his past. He simply worked. And his work spoke louder than anything else. The project that had been stuck for weeks began to move forward. Ideas flowed. Problems were solved. The entire team felt the shift. But outside of work, Armin's life remained grounded. Every evening, he returned to his small apartment, where his young son waited for him with wide eyes and boundless energy. To his son, he wasn't a fallen architect or a rising consultant. He was just, father. And that was enough. Syra, on the other hand, found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She started listening more. Observing more. Questioning her assumptions. Because Armin's presence had exposed something deeper, not just in her company, but in her leadership. Talent didn't always wear suits. Brilliance didn't always sit in boardrooms. Sometimes, it walked quietly through hallways, unnoticed, waiting for someone to look beyond the surface. As the project reached completion, it became one of the most successful designs the company had ever produced. Not just because of its structure, but because of the story behind it. A story of loss. Of resilience. Of second chances. And just before we reach the end, here's something special. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged unfairly, or given a second chance that changed your life? Because stories like this aren't just fiction, they reflect something real in all of us. On the day of the final presentation, Armin stood beside Syra, not behind her. Not invisible. Not forgotten. Equal. Recognized. Valued. And as the applause filled the room, something shifted permanently. Not just in his life. But in hers. Because sometimes, the greatest designs aren't the ones we create on paper. They're the ones we build within ourselves. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that people deserve to be seen, heard, and given a chance, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes the Stories. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Because in a world that often judges too quickly, kindness might just be the most powerful design of all.